Hello, I'm Tim Wall, Senior Reporter for Pet Food Industry. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Ask the Pet Food Pro, How the Gut Microbiome Impacts Pet Skin, Joint, and Oral Health. Ask the Pet Food Pro connects experts with industry professionals and offers the opportunity to pose questions directly. Ask the Pet Food Pro is brought to you by Pet Food Forum and Pet Food Industry's journalists and editors. Drawing on our combined decades of experience covering the dog, cat, and other pet food markets, you can find our reporting and analysis at petfoodindustry.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our daily newsletter and monthly magazine. Today's discussion focuses on the future of the gut microbiome and how it impacts the health of cats and dogs and other pets. Pet food ingredient producer Cargill sponsors this edition of Ask the Pet Food Pro. And welcome back to our expert guest, Jess Jarrett, PhD, R&D Principal Scientist for Pet at Cargill, and two-time Ask the Pet Food Pro guest. Welcome back, Jess, and thank you for joining us today.
Thanks. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for the intro. I'm Jess Jarrett, leading global R&D for Pet at Cargill. A little bit about me. My scientific background is primarily as a microbiologist and computational biologist. I've worked with a lot of host-associated microbiomes from a variety of hosts and environments, and I've been having a lot of fun working in the pet microbiome space specifically for about the last 7 years. And on a personal level, also a real pet lover. Helping pets is a big interest of mine, and have spent a lot of time volunteering as an adoption counselor at some local cat rescues also. So really happy to be here today.
Nice. And we're happy to have you. So before we do start the discussion, though, I have a few announcements. Audience members, you have all been muted to ensure that everyone can hear and focus on the discussion. I've included many of the questions that you all sent in beforehand into our script, but if you have a question during the discussion, please submit that or any comments in the chat box. Please note that this chat is being recorded, so you can access the recording starting in about a week at petfoodforumevents.com. Click on the Ask the Pet Food Pro tab at the top. So, all right, let's start our discussion of the microbiome with some of the basics. And we're getting down to it. How do we define a healthy gut microbiome in pets? And how consistent is that definition?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we think about gut microbiome or any microbiome, we can think about what should that microbiome be doing and also who should be there. So we're looking for a microbiome that does perform certain functions. So in the gut, some of those might be producing beneficial metabolites or converting bile acids, helping to digest food. And the community should be fairly stable and resilient to disruption. And when we think about who should be there, this gets a little bit trickier because there's a lot of different species of microbes that can perform the same functions. So a lot of what we do is looking at large populations of healthy animals and seeing which bacteria do we see over and over and over in these healthy animals. And those are what we call the core microbiome in healthy pets. So I think we're arriving at a pretty broadly shared definition of what that is for cats and dogs, but it does involve looking at, in many cases, hundreds of healthy animals to arrive at that conclusion. Yeah.
Gotcha. And amongst all those healthy animals, what are some of the factors that shape that gut microbiome? Is it diet, age, environment, genetics, a mix?
Yeah, certainly cats and dogs do have different microbiomes, which we can talk about too. Diet is a huge factor, especially for pets. The different macronutrient compositions of different diets have a huge influence on the microbiome. Interestingly, moisture content of the diet, independent of macros, also seems to have effects on the microbiome. As pets age, their microbiomes tend to decline in diversity, especially for cats, whether or not they are allowed to go outside, do they hunt prey outside, this sort of thing, which gets as well into exposure to parasites and pathogens can affect the microbiome. For dogs, different body sizes can help shape that. And of course, health conditions, obesity, that sort of stuff. And for our pets, because they're our animals, sometimes they do need antibiotics, and that has a very powerful influence on the microbiome as well. Host genetics a little bit does affect it, but I think less so compared to some of these other factors.
Interesting. A lot of factors playing in there. So how do you know that? How do we go about measuring all this and understanding the diversity of the microbiome within a research setting?
Yeah, a lot of this is sequencing-based work. So when it comes to the gut microbiome, we tend to take fecal samples as a fairly representative look at what's going on in the gut. For other body sites like the skin, you might consider swabs or other methods like this. We look at the DNA usually of the bacteria that are present there. So you can look at marker genes. Those are really helpful, especially for body sites like skin, where the biomass of bacteria is not huge. And you can also use quantitative methods to look at some of those marker genes. The dysbiosis index that people might be familiar with is an example of that. And there's also other methods where you can look at the entire gene content of the bacteria, so you can get a sense of who is there and also what are they capable of doing. There are some other less common methods. Culturing certainly used to be much more commonly used prior to the advent of some of these higher throughput sequencing methods, and still is very helpful for other specific questions, let's say.
Gotcha. Gene
Yeah.
sequencing. Okay. So we talked in the intro about the joints, the skin, oral microbiome. How are all these organs and body systems influenced by the gut microbiome? Which ones are? It seems like almost everything.
Yeah, that's almost the joke these days, right? Is it's shorter to say which systems we haven't yet linked to the microbiome, either the microbiome that's resident there or to the gut or both. You can put in almost any organ system hyphen gut axis into Google Scholar and come up with a lot of results. Yeah, a lot of this happens through circulating metabolites that are absorbed into the bloodstream, and also through a lot of immune system signaling and other signaling processes that begin in the gut, particularly.
Gotcha. So before we go further, we talked about all the good things happening in the microbiome, but we got a question before the show about the other side of that. How can a gut microbiome, when it's in dysbiosis, be harmful to a pet's health? Or how do gut-derived endotoxins affect pets' health and longevity?
Yeah, definitely. So for folks who may not be as familiar as the question asker, endotoxins are a component of the cell wall of certain types of gram-negative bacteria. And so when those bacteria die and those cell wall components and outer cell components are released, that can cause a lot of inflammation. Those are actually very potent pro-inflammatory compounds in the gut and in the body in general. Most of those, one of those that you might see mentioned a lot is LPS, or lipopolysaccharides. So those molecules can activate receptors throughout the body, and there's a ton of disease associations that we've tied to endotoxins in human beings: diabetes, Alzheimer's, liver disease, etc. So a lot of what we think about there is if there is inappropriate permeability of the gut. So if too much is getting through the gut barrier, right? Obviously, things need to get through there so that we can absorb and pets can absorb nutrients and energy from their food, but it has to be the appropriate types of molecules and the appropriate size. So if there's a lot of endotoxins going on, that can really lead to this sort of chronic inflammatory state, which is, of course, linked to a lot of different health conditions.
Gotcha. So I noticed while you were mentioning there that you mentioned humans and pets in the same sentence. It seems, especially amongst humans, the microbiome has gotten a lot of attention. It's certainly something that people are aware of, and there's similarities with the pet there. But how much awareness of the pet gut microbiome do those pet owners have, do you think?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of this awareness is coming over, bleeding over from the human side, basically, right? So people have this concept for themselves of, oh, gut health is important. And so they transfer that over to their pets, right? That's, I think, a really key starting point that people are coming from. But beyond that, I think a lot of the awareness is a little foggy or a little vague, right? People might not really understand what are some of the key things that I could change in my pet's life or in their diet that would help to shape their microbiome. They may not understand that for themselves either, right? They may not understand how conditions like obesity might affect their pet's microbiome. And certainly, I think it's not very well known how the influences that the microbiome can have on all these other body systems, I think, is not super well understood. And it goes for humans and even more so for pets, I think.
So kind of going on from there, what are some of the real common misconceptions that people might have with that lack of understanding?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of individuality in the microbiome. So there's how to say that. So yeah, it's going to vary between different pets and different people, right? And that's both a challenge and an opportunity for us in terms of helping our pets with their health. And as I mentioned, I think those connections between the gut and how that can affect other body systems are not things that people are aware of. Simultaneously, there's, I think, sometimes a belief that among people who do have some knowledge that the microbiome can fix or cure everything, which, as much as I love it, I don't think is necessarily the case either. So there's sometimes a belief that some of these biotic ingredients can cure everything completely, and I think that's also not necessarily the case. Unfortunately, I would love it if that was true. But so I think there's a lot of opportunity for us scientists and pet professionals to really communicate more clearly and to put those dots a little closer together for pet parents.
Gotcha. So, speaking of misconceptions, it's been said that oftentimes people will think of a cat as if it were a small dog, but they're biologically very, very different. So, speaking of the microbiome, what are some of the key differences there in the gut microbiome between cats and dogs?
Yeah, I mean, of course, as you're alluding to, right, cats are obligate carnivores. That's certainly a key difference. Evolutionarily, there's a lot of differences in the gut microbiome due to the physiology of the intestine, the foods that they would eat, and the nutrient profile of those foods. Both of them are quite going to be quite adaptable to different nutrient profiles of the food that you give them. I would say one of the key differences is that cats do tend to have more diverse microbiomes relative to dogs. And interestingly, if you compare cats to each other, a large population of cats, that tends to be more consistent as well relative to dogs, which tend to be have a little bit more variation between individuals,
Hmm.
which may also reflect, I think, the genetic and breeding history of cats versus dogs, right? There's a lot more breed diversity in dogs than there is in cats.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So, going from the general of the microbiome and how it works with dogs, cats, and everything, let's scratch the surface of some of the effects of the gut microbiome, starting with the skin. So, when we're talking about one of those axes, like we were talking about before, how does the gut skin axis influence dermatological conditions in dogs and cats?
Yeah, so for a lot of these areas that I'll be talking about, I think it's important to preface, ironically, we often use humans as a model species for cats and dogs because there's a lot of research dollars put there. Rodents as well, of course, but worth mentioning and prefacing there. One of the things that cue people to look at this is this observation, oh, people with atopic dermatitis and dogs with canine atopic dermatitis and these other inflammatory skin conditions, they do really have different microbiomes. So then people started looking at, okay, what are the metabolites, like circulating metabolites that are made by the gut? What do these look like in these different populations? And indeed, we do see lower levels of these beneficial metabolites that are beneficial molecules that are being made by the gut microbiome. We see lower levels of those in people with atopic dermatitis. In mice, if you're able to restore some of those levels, you can really improve the skin barrier. And there's been a lot of very compelling work in multiple species looking at fecal microbiome transfer, or transplants, which is taking the microbiome from a healthy animal and giving that microbiome to a sick animal via feces. A lot of really impressive results for atopic dermatitis and other sorts of skin conditions. And then when we start pulling out the mechanisms for that, it does look like when we can increase those beneficial metabolites like short chain fatty acids, that helps to improve the barrier integrity of the gut. So then we don't have so many of these really large, inappropriately large molecules moving from the gut into circulation where they can trigger inflammation and allergy. And there's also a lot of immune system signaling that begins in the gut, which can trigger systemic inflammation, production of pro-inflammatory molecules and cytokines, et cetera. There's a lot more there that I can go on forever. It's also really fascinating that to me that this axis is like very bidirectional, right? We think of the gut affecting the health of the skin, but also work in rodents. That's super interesting. If you wound the skin of the mouse, and that also alters what's happening in the gut. So it's a bidirectional crosstalk that happens. Super
Huh,
fascinating.
that's amazing. Yeah, I mean,
And really interesting when we start thinking about pets and the itch scratch cycle, right? Because so
yeah.
many pets, it's difficult to stop them from scratching and sometimes wounding themselves if they're very itchy and inflamed. Yeah.
That's fascinating. So that actually kind of anticipated my next question here about some of these interactions between the skin microbiome and the gut microbiome. You'd mentioned short chain fatty acids. Could you maybe tell us a little bit more about some of those microbial metabolites and how they act as the kind of mediators of this interaction?
Yeah, definitely. So those metabolites tend to be produced, as I said, in the gut by certain beneficial bacteria. Butyrate is a key one that really is important for the integrity of the gut barrier. So then they can be absorbed by the host and enter circulation. So these are also really powerful signaling molecules for the immune system in and of themselves. So those short chain fatty acids, as they circulate throughout the host, start to affect skin barrier function, for instance, right? Which can then start to affect the microbiome that's on the skin. Some of those can stimulate like differentiation of cells in the skin, which is an important part of the turnover process in the skin. They can affect production of collagen, and some of them even have direct antimicrobial properties. So they're super important players in a lot of these systems. And we'll be talking, I think, about short chain fatty acids. People will be tired of hearing me say that, I think, by the end, for sure.
Interesting. So those are some things that are produced from the gut microbiome, but what about some of the things that we put into it? What role do some of the biotic ingredients that have become popularly prebiotics, probiotics, postbiotics play in modulating the microbiome and affecting the subsequent skin inflammation or repair of inflammation?
Yeah, so I think there's certainly effects that some of those ingredients can have directly on signaling to the host immune system. That's one category of way that they work. Another category would be affecting the gut microbiome itself, either who is there, what are they doing, what types of metabolites are they producing. And in some cases, some of these ingredients can provide some of those metabolites and compounds directly to the gut or to the pet. This is a really active area of research, I'll say, as well. There's even a couple of studies for certain ingredients in other species where some of those outperform systemic drugs for some of these conditions, which is really impressive. So, how we think that this works is some of these microbial metabolites. So, key things that we think about here again are those short chain fatty acids. Also, certain metabolites of tryptophan can interact with various receptors. The HR receptor is a big one, and those are present throughout the body. And there's a lot of them in the gut, and there's also a lot of them in the skin. Probiotics can produce some of these metabolites. Prebiotics can really help some of the existing microbes to produce some of these metabolites. Interestingly, it does seem like for some of these things that either a sort of sustained delivery and or an appropriate, how to say, releasing the metabolites at the appropriate location in the gut may be important as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about one of the other things we put into our guts, some of our food sources. How do dietary protein sources, especially we're thinking about like an animal-based protein versus a plant-based protein or anything like that, how does that shape the microbiome and in turn then affect skin inflammation or even potentially allergy responses, considering how many allergy responses are related to proteins?
Yeah, so I think there's two pieces here, right? So there's the piece of the protein source, and then there's also the piece where people can have this perception, right, that a pet may be sensitive to a particular protein. I think some of that sensitivity perception may be coming from, again, increased gut permeability and like some of these really large molecules from food are getting into places where they shouldn't be, right? And that's provoking a reaction in the pet. So I think supporting better gut barrier integrity can really help with that. When it comes to thinking about plant versus animal-based ingredients, this is a place where I so wish that we were not using humans and rodents as the model species, because dogs and cats are largely carnivorous, right? Or in the case of cats, exclusively carnivorous. And what we know about some of these digestive processes may be different between carnivores and these other species. For instance, we typically think about bacteria that produce butyrate, we typically think about that happening from prebiotics like fiber sources, but there are some bacteria in dogs and in cats that are capable of producing butyrate from protein sources. Anyway, I could go on about that, but we do see that amino acid composition, digestibility of those proteins can really shape the microbiome. And in general, we want to be able to promote microbiomes that produce more of those short chain fatty acids, and in particular, more butyrate. So those are the directions that I think it's interesting to go in, as well as supporting that gut barrier integrity to prevent some of those really large food molecules from passing through.
And there's a lot of variables involved there. You know, the protein sources, the species, and all the
Yeah, which I think a lot of people who have a really itchy pet will tell you they really go through a lot trying to figure out some of these problems for their
yeah.
pets.
Yeah. Speaking of inflammation and irritating things, let's bend the conversation to the gut joint axis. When we're talking about like an inflamed joint or something like that, things like that, what evidence supports that connection between the gut and the various joints of the body in companion animals? And is that also similar to what's been found in humans?
Yeah, again, another species where we do tend to use humans and rodents as the model species for our pets. So this is another place where we've started with some of these observations that, hey, animals or individuals who have some of these joint conditions do tend to have differences in their microbiomes. And you can also look into the joint itself and see some of these inflammatory features and even see, in some cases, DNA from microbes that are coming from the gut. Not to say that they're colonizing, but it's certainly interesting. Also, we're seeing that there's a sort of an analogy between what happens naturally in joints and in cartilage and what happens in the gut. So in the gut, mucus is produced to line the gut, and there's a sort of continuous process of turnover where that mucus is produced by the host and broken down by bacteria, and that process should be in balance, ideally. And for joints, it's similar for cartilage, right? There's cartilage always being broken down and then remodeled. When we have an imbalance in that process and a bias towards the degradation of cartilage instead, and that can really start provoking this inflammatory reaction in the joint and positive feedback loop of inflammation, if you will. So where the gut microbiome and microbiome really comes into there is having dysbiosis in the gut, we know triggers a lot of these pro-inflammatory signaling processes and can really perpetuate those problems. So some of the pharmaceutical options are trying to intervene in that inflammatory signaling process, but you can also think of dialing that down starting within the gut. And this is another place, again, where FMT or fecal microbiome transfer experiments involving that are very, very, very interesting. In mice, you can really either induce or sort of turn off these arthritic processes in the joints, depending on how you handle how the microbiome is.
Gotcha. And this is off topic, off the questions that we were asking at least, but it just made me think about how dogs will tend to eat their own poo sometimes. Does that somehow play into trying to maintain their microbiome, or do they eat each other's to try and do like their own kind of fecal transplants?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's been people wondering about this, right? So, as someone who has some knowledge about the prevalence of, for instance, asymptomatic Giardia in otherwise healthy dogs, I would be aware of that, the ability to transfer parasites and pathogens. But yeah, that's one proposed reason why coprophagy, as well as nutritional, if you're a scavenger, it's food, I guess. But certainly, yes, it can also be a way of being the microbiome, let's say. Yeah.
Well, speaking of diet, are there any other diet-induced changes maybe that a pet owner or a pet food formulator could make to encourage those immune pathways in the microbiome that connect to joint health?
Yeah, definitely. Again, so anything that's going to really help improve that gut barrier integrity and dial down some of that inflammatory signaling coming from the gut would be something that we think should be beneficial. And that's exactly what we see in some of this research, right? So in rodents, you can give them higher fiber diets, which can, again, increase the short chain fatty acids in their circulation and notably reduce the severity of arthritis. Interestingly, they were able to recapitulate that by just directly feeding some of those short chain fatty acids to the rodents. In humans, there's been some work on anti-inflammatory diets and reduced pain. Really, excuse me, an interesting analogy, excuse me, to pets there. Gosh, I hope I don't need a cough drop. We'll get there. An interesting analogy to pets is that because it's microbiome mediated, not every person in that trial actually responded to the intervention. And I think there's an interesting lesson for us there too with our pets, because we know there's variability in the microbiome. So if how we're exerting an effect is via the microbiome, I think it's reasonable to expect that not every pet is going to respond, because not every pet may have those beneficial bacteria in place in the gut to grow. In people, they saw some key taxa, some key groups of microbes that if you can promote their growth, they really helped to ease arthritis and some of those inflammatory processes. But again, if you don't have that group already in your microbiome, maybe those are some of the people who didn't respond to that intervention. So I think lessons there for us for pets as well. And that's where some other types of, ingredients like probiotics and adding the beneficial microbes or components of them directly can also have a really protective effect.
Gotcha. So on that topic of diet, the very beginning of the digestive system is connected to the gut microbiome too. And actually, I'm noticing we're getting a whole bunch of questions, so I'll make this probably our last question, then we'll jump into some of those.
Great.
Sorry, all you folks in the audience, we will get to you. So first, how does the oral microbiome and the gut microbiome influence each other? And what are some of the health outcomes of that interaction?
Yeah, this is really fascinating. It's the kind of thing that makes you think, oh, maybe I should shift to this because it's so powerful, right? So the links between oral health and sort of overall health are really powerful. Periodontal disease is linked to, and oral dysbiosis in general are linked to like IBD, various types of arthritis, neurodegenerative diseases, diabetes, gastrointestinal cancers, like almost you name it, right? So when we think about how could that happen, I think it's important to know a little bit about the periodontal disease process. So basically there's bacterial biofilms, like a slime layer, if you will, that will form on the teeth and the oral surfaces. Over time, that can become calcified, which is what we call calculus. An analogy here would be like a coral reef, which if that doesn't make you brush your teeth, I don't know what will. And then if pathogenic bacteria are allowed to colonize in these biofilms, they can really release all these toxins and enzymes and trigger this host immune response. And interesting, also alter the behavior of other bacteria that are living in the mouth. Then you get set up into this inflammatory process where there's tissue damage. That creates a much better environment for those pathogens, it releases nutrients that feed those pathogens as well. And then you set up this sort of chronic inflammatory process. And because this is a mucous membrane in your mouth, also some of these pathogens are even able to either enter immune cells or enter the bloodstream directly from the mouth, as well as, of course, being swallowed, right? So when we think about how are these things influencing each other, especially when you have some of these disease processes happening in the mouth, you have a direct sort of repeated input potentially of pathogens to the gut through swallowing, as well they can move through the body and go colonize in the gut and really disrupt what's happening in the gut. This is also bidirectional in pets. I think it's important to think about pet behavior too, in terms of licking things and licking all their body and all of that.
Yeah.
So yeah, and we do see again in models where we can give antibiotics or where we can use FMT that starting an inflammatory process in the gut can also really trigger inflammatory processes in the mouth and tissues in the mouth as well. Yeah.
Amazing to think about how it's all connected. Like, a dog licks itself when it gets hurt, or licks it, or cat cleans itself, and it's connecting its oral microbiome to its skin microbiome to its gut microbiome. It's amazing.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of those amazing connections, it looks like we've got some audience members who have some amazing questions of their own. I'm going to go ahead and go through these questions, and hopefully we'll have enough time. Thank you, everybody, for sending all these questions. Okay. First question, have you seen differences in the microbiome in the more ancient dog breeds like Canadian sled dogs versus more modern dog breeds?
Oh, interesting. I am not aware necessarily of that research, not to say it hasn't been done. There is some interesting research into, for instance, the microbiome of wolves, both captive and wild animals. That's very interesting. Yeah. But it's certainly something that would be interesting to look into, I would say. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
And
I
some of
actually
those dogs do have a lot more exposure as well to the natural environment, to dirt and soil and all of that, which tends to promote a healthier microbiome.
Yeah, it brings up a lot of questions like an indoor dog versus an outdoor dog. And
That's a huge one. Yeah. Yeah.
so speaking of differences between animals, here's a big one, I'm sure, too. How does obesity influence the microbiome? What's the evidence there?
Yeah, that's another one of these sort of bidirectional pieces. There's a lot of research into this, and certainly on the human side and also on the pet side as well. So this can go both ways. So you can, for instance, in mice, you can take the feces from an obese mouse and transplant it into a lean mouse, and then now you have a chubby mouse over here as well, and vice versa. That can really work. So the microbiome can really set up an animal to either be predisposed to obesity or not. There's some interesting work where some microbiomes are much more efficient at extracting energy from food than others. So you can kind of play with that, right? So if you tend to reduce calories, you tend to get a more efficient gut microbiome that's better at extracting calories from food. But you can have periodic times of higher calories and higher nutrition to sort of trick the microbiome away from adapting into that more efficient state, which is super interesting. But yeah, and we know that in obese animals that more pro-inflammatory microbiome is pretty common. That's very involved in a lot of those negative health outcomes that we see from obesity and overweight in our pets.
Yeah, it's all part of the obesity epidemic in pets.
Yeah.
Okay, that one. So how about a kind of a more specific one about measuring gut barrier integrity? How do we measure gut barrier integrity directly in living pets?
Yeah, so experimentally, this is not something I would necessarily recommend for anybody's pet, but in a scientific setting, there are certain molecules that you can give, compounds that you can give orally, and then look for them in a blood sample, for instance. So you should know that this molecule should not really be passing from the gut into the bloodstream. So if I see it there, that's a negative indicator. You can as well look for other things like, again, if you see like LPS, some of these bacterial components, if you're seeing a lot of that in the circulation, that's a not necessarily a super positive sign. Yeah, in vivo is one. And in vitro in the lab, you can also culture some of these cells from the gut lining and test compounds directly. That's how we have derived a lot of this information about the effects of ingredients on gut barrier integrity. But yeah, in living animals, it's a little trickier for sure.
Kind of use like a tracer kind of thing.
Yeah.
Okay, how about what is the application or what are the prospects for application of Bacillus subtilis into pet food?
I'm sure the questioner probably is aware. Bacillus is a spore-forming bacteria, which can be really helpful in pet food applications because those bacterial spores tend to be quite resistant and able to survive a lot of conditions that are challenging for other live bacteria to survive. So that's a nice piece. When we think about adding probiotics in general, I would say a lot of how we think that those things work is again through like microbial patterns and aspects of those bacteria interacting with the immune system and interacting with signaling. So I'd say that's a key aspect of how that works.
Gotcha.
But yeah, spore formers are, I think, much easier to use sometimes than other types of bacteria in pet food applications.
You had mentioned that short chain fatty acids like butyrate play key roles in maintaining gut and skin barrier integrity. Are there specific dietary fibers or substrates in pet food that have proven particularly effective at increasing those beneficial metabolites?
Yeah, interestingly, rather than like specific fibers, I do think that having a variety or a diversity of types of fiber in the diet seems to be important, right? Because if you're giving quite a lot of one or two or even three different fibers, you can tend over time, I think you can tend to promote the growth of just a fairly small subset of that community of bacteria. Whereas if you provide a broader range of fiber sources, I think that can be something quite beneficial. As well, also worth mentioning for carnivores, right? Like our cats and dogs, that there are some bacteria that can produce things like butyrate from protein. So it's another, not exactly what the questioner is asking, right? But another approach or way of thinking about that, solving that problem.
Piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
Let's see. So, how many days of supplementation with an additive are typically required to observe modulation of the gut microbiota in dogs? And how long should the washout period be to allow the microbiota to return to a stable baseline?
This is a great question and very relevant to a lot of these types of studies, right? Gut microbiomes can change fairly rapidly. Myself personally, I tend to like to give about at least 30 days before you start looking at the gut microbiome when you're adding something that you think is going to modulate it. And that should give your whole study population, or I guess if you're thinking of an individual pet, give your individual pet some time for those changes to take place within the microbial community, and then also for some of those changes downstream in the host that we're probably hoping to see in terms of inflammation for those processes to start changing as well. In terms of a washout, this can be tricky because sometimes you can have differences in the microbiome that do really persist longer than we think. They can be subtle, but they can really persist. So if anybody is thinking of doing some studies, I do caution to think really carefully about whether you want to do a washout design or whether you want to have just different groups of animals. That's kind of a Rosianne, I don't know how to say your name exactly, but I would love to dive into that with anybody. I love talking about study design and all that.
So, speaking of which, I believe the folks from Cargill will be able to get in contact with anybody in the audience. So, Rosianne, if you want to reach out, you should be able to.
Please do.
Let's see. We were talking about dogs and cats differences earlier. Are you aware of how dogs and cats respond differently to fibers in terms of the microbial endpoints produced in products produced?
Oh yeah. I would have to do some reading to make sure that I don't say the wrong thing, but I would imagine that this would primarily have to do with those sort of pre-existing microbial differences between cats and dogs, right? Yeah, so if you're starting with kind of a different microbiome in the beginning, you're going to be promoting the growth of different bacteria there in cats and dogs. But I would say for both, the general sort of accepted wisdom is that fibers are going to be beneficial and produce a lot of those beneficial metabolites, generally speaking.
Okay, BT, we talked about that one. How about going back in time and for those cats and dogs, how about prebiotic fiber for puppies and kittens? Is it particularly important for them?
Yeah, so when we think about development of animals, especially very early development, And there's a lot of really fascinating research from germ-free mice and other such animals. So the microbiome, especially in very early life, is super important to training the immune system to respond appropriately to a healthy microbiome and to challenges in general, right? If if you can get some of the right bacteria there very early in life, that has benefits for the lifetime of the animal. So I think, yeah, prebiotic fiber could be a fantastic way of doing that for puppies and kittens. And again, we see that in the human space with like milk oligosaccharides are specifically feed some of these beneficial bacteria in human infants and are very important to infant nutrition and healthy development. So yeah, I would expect fully the same for puppies and kittens.
Gotcha. So this actually plays into or could flow into this next question, that what are some of the most promising trends or emerging ingredients in microbiome friendly pet food? And just tying them together, is there a role for prebiotic puppy and kitten formulations?
Yeah, I would imagine so. Yeah. And certainly, where possible, a rule for puppies and kittens staying with mom for as long as possible. Not, again, not always possible. Having done work in cat rescues, sometimes you get a kitten, and that's the one that you get. Yeah, promising trends and ingredients. I think there's from like waste streams, there's so many interesting like plant ingredients that are coming out with different fibers and other polyphenols, other potentially beneficial ingredients. I love all of the work that lots of people are doing on different postbiotics. I think there's a lot of opportunity to explore bacteria that may not be safe or feasible to use in a live application, to explore those as postbiotics. There's opportunity to explore other yeast-based postbiotics as well. Yeah, I'm excited about all of that kind of stuff. And if we can have more ways to have live probiotics a little bit easier to use, again, those remain challenging to use in some of these food applications because of stability, viability. I think that would also be a very interesting avenue to explore.
Gotcha. So let's see, this one's kind of a recap of some of our earlier questions, getting a little deeper into them. A couple questions here. Are there any specific probiotics that would help balance the microbiome for most pets? How do you address the endotoxins causing inflammation? And what is your advice for skin issues related to imbalanced gut microbiome?
Oh, we got a lot. We got a lot there. All right.
Rehashing.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of probiotics, I think it's important that to think that when we're taking probiotics, we're not necessarily expecting them to colonize and to remain forever in the gut of the pet. So I would want to think about those as performing a specific function, like while you're feeding them, and that may be, again, like immune signaling, anti-inflammatory sort of signaling is a key one. I would say certainly all the lactic acid bacteria are super commonly used for those types of applications. In terms of recommending specific ones, that's a little bit trickier to do. And I would say in really severe cases with like especially skin gut microbiome issues, there's a lot of very compelling research on fecal microbiome transplant, particularly in dogs. Very interesting. It's not exactly a nuclear option, but it's not a first line sort of a treatment, but it can be very helpful for some of those really stubborn things, especially for pets who've maybe been through like a lot of rounds of antibiotics. Some of these most beneficial bacteria in the gut of our pets can be very sensitive to antibiotics. And when it's necessary, but it's not necessarily easy for pets to bounce back from that, I would say.
Gotcha. Okay, here's a specific one. What are your thoughts on feed kind microbial fermentation protein as a microbiome enhancer in dog food?
Oh, okay. I'm not so familiar with this one, but based on the question, I'm going to guess that this is a protein produced through microbial fermentation. So, what would I think about that? So, that would seem to be if you have a pet who might be sensitive or have some sort of allergic response to other types of proteins, that seems like it might be something that a pet would be less sensitive to. Other than that, not knowing so much about it, it's tough for me to answer. I apologize.
Yeah, just looking it up real quick. It looks like feed kind, sustainable feed for sustainable worlds, protein of, it's a family of natural, sustainable, and traceable feed ingredients. So looks like it's maybe like sustainable protein.
I love the sustainability aspect. That's certainly a big one for pets.
Yeah. Oh, so this is maybe tying into it. So are there any experiences using microbial proteins in dog and cat feeds, which I guess you just kind of went on there, are more or less pro-inflammatory than vegetable proteins? So I guess, yeah, are there differences between microbial proteins, plant proteins, animal?
Yeah, that'd be an interesting one. I'm not aware of too much literature on that, but it'd be an interesting aspect to explore for sure. Yeah. And yeah, again, I would fully expect that if there are pets who have over a period of time, right, developed a reaction or an immune reaction to some of the more traditional proteins, that if you're giving them a very alternative, like very different protein, that yeah, that may not trigger that immune response, right? Similar sort of idea as people are trying to achieve by switching to some of these more exotic proteins.
Gotcha. And so this is going back to the oral microbiome questions that we had kind of skipped over. But how does it going backwards? How does the gut microbiome then affect the oral microbiome?
Yeah, so I think here there's an opportunity to think about the inflammatory environment or lack thereof in the mouth. So if you have dysbiosis happening in the gut, that sets up sort of this systemic level of inflammation, which again is also going to affect the tissues in the mouth, right? And if you have that inflammation going on in the mouth, that can create an environment that's very permissive for some of those bad bacteria or those pathogens in the mouth. So one might expect, and we do see from some of the, again, rodent research in particular, that if you can improve, if you will, the gut microbiome, that can really help the oral microbiome as well. Yeah.
Gotcha.
And of course, again, dogs and cats, more so dogs. Cats are a little less likely to eat poop, I would say, but certainly that's a place as well where that can maybe come into play.
Gotcha. There's another factor, another variable in it. Is there an optimal time to feed pets certain
Huh.
ingredients to improve gut function or support a healthy gut microbiome?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Certainly, I would say if you have the pet in their early development, not, I mean, not all of us do, right? Acquire a pet at that point in their life. That's certainly a really interesting window of time to consider. I would say if there are challenges that the pet is facing, antibiotic treatment would be a key example here. That might also be a really nice window of time to provide a little bit of extra support. And when pets are kind of having, there are those pets that do have occasional or recurring GI issues. Those I think would be more of an ongoing basis. And I think certainly there's nothing wrong with feeding most of these things on an ongoing basis. But there are probably, yeah, some certain windows of time when you can get a little bit more bang for your buck.
Gotcha. So speaking of comparing different species and animals as we were before, this one goes into the livestock realm. You mentioned the link between gut barrier integrity and joint health and arthritis in pets. Is this a similar mechanism to what's seen in chondronecrosis in broilers?
Oh, interesting. I'm not familiar with this, but I can definitely look into it. Yeah, could definitely. Thanks for the tip. I will check that out.
You got your next paper idea.
Yeah.
Let's see. Is it true that there's actually not good evidence that probiotics from non-dog resources are effective? Some claim that it has to be a strain from a dog, but only a few brands include strains, I guess, isolated from dogs' actual guts.
Sure. Yeah, I don't want to start a fight here. I would say I think there's a difference between effectiveness and colonization or persistence in the gut. Let me start with that. I think things can be effective without colonizing. So maybe once you stop feeding the probiotic, maybe you no longer see it in the dog, but that doesn't, or the cat, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't provide a benefit while you were feeding. I think that's one piece. However, yeah, I wouldn't necessarily expect non-native strains of probiotics to colonize. And worth noting, a lot of what we think of as probiotics, again, the lactic acid bacteria, are not super abundant in the gut microbiomes of healthy dogs anyway. The sort of core taxa in dogs are not necessarily going to be like a lactobacillus or bifidobacterium. So that's another piece. But I do think that there's a lot of good research on efficacy while you are feeding some of those ingredients. Yeah, which is separate from colonization.
Gotcha. Interesting. Hadn't even thought about that myself. So, what would be a generalized framework to promote a healthy gut flora? Can you give us a sense of what a formulation, like an ideal formulation for that would be, maybe?
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to achieve this for pets. And again, it's going to depend on dog versus cat, size of the animal, especially for dogs. I do tend to like, and I'm not a formulator, I don't even play one on TV, but certainly I would say having some of those beneficial fibers in there would be a really key aspect. And me personally, I tend to prefer or believe that a blend of fibers may be more beneficial than having just one or two sources of fiber. So having a diversity of those different types of fiber molecules in there, I think could be very beneficial. There's beyond that, there's a ton of different directions that I think that one could go in. Yeah.
Gotcha. Diversity of fiber is strength. Okay, so we have a question here from a PhD working on Greenland sled dogs, nutrition and
Oh,
metabolism.
fun.
She,
Hope they get to go to Greenland.
oh, that'd
Send
be
us pictures if so.
yeah, I will do a reporting trip there. Thank you. Okay, we hope they look into their microbiome and compare it to some of the more modern European breeds. Okay, so going back to that interesting question from before, there seem to be many biological differences between this ancient and extreme breed and modern breeds. If this is something you would find interesting to discuss, please contact me. Sorry, that wasn't even a question. That was just an interesting observation. So
Well,
yes,
it is interesting. Yeah. Yeah. That's awesome.
yeah, very cool. Let's see. Wow, we actually got through all the questions. We have just one left. Which probiotic species are the best candidates to colonize the gut when used as dietary supplements?
Ah, interesting. I love this question. So I'm I'm moderately biased in that I used to work for a company that did make fecal microbiome transplants. So as a microbiologist, putting on my microbiologist hat, my answer would be things that are derived from that same host species, which is tricky because some of those bacteria are going to be really difficult to grow and provide in a supplement. Yeah, that's probably the short answer there. Unfortunately, if colonization is the goal. But worth saying that I think that how to say, I think there's also good reason to think that things like outdoor exposure, activity, and really trying to set the stage for a good gut environment. A lot of pets are going to be naturally re-exposed to those bacteria anyway. So if they have lost them somehow and you still have a good environment for them to live in, there's reason to think that they're going to come back. It'd be, I would love if all of these key bacteria from cats and dogs were available as probiotics and commercially available, and we could know what we need and just add everything or add whatever is needed. Like that would be the dream. But until we get there, I think trying to set the stage and prepare the ground for those microbes and having a bit of patience and hoping that they come back in from the outside environment is probably the best approach.
Gotcha. Now it goes back almost to the first thing we talked about is all the variables that come into it and how environment is so important.
Yeah.
So going back to what we talked about also about probiotics, prebiotics, and whatnot, since postbiotics are more resistant during pet food manufacturing process, would it be more efficient to use them versus probiotics? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, certainly that's a direction that a lot of people are moving into, right? Postbiotics are a lot easier to use and yes, a lot more resistant. And because so much of this effect can come from signaling, right? So it's not necessarily they can signal to the other bacteria, they can signal to the host and change behavior of other bacteria and change immune responses in the host. Those microbes don't necessarily need to be alive in order to do that function. You just may need the pieces of them and in some cases, the metabolites that they produce that may be present in that postbiotic, right? So that is a direction that a lot of companies, both ingredient manufacturing companies as well as pet food manufacturing companies, are moving into. And interestingly, there's a lot of work showing that you can take the same strain as a probiotic and then give it as a postbiotic, and it is equally effective, or in a couple of cases, even more effective as a postbiotic, which is, I found that surprising to see higher efficacy, but it's certainly really interesting. Maybe there's access to some of those internal components of the cell that are having effects too that you see in a postbiotic.
Right, right. Interesting. So actually, I'm going to jump back to a question and we have just enough time for that we skipped from our script. I was wondering about how specific diets, like you often hear about raw diets as being better for a dog's teeth and oral microbiome. How do specific diets, dry, kibble, raw, influence the oral microbiome's composition and subsequent plaque formation?
Yeah, this is, I think, an area where we definitely need more research in terms of a lot of the comparisons here are between wet and dry food. There is not a lot of research on, I would say, yeah, raw diets or diets that might have physical components of the diet other than dry kibble that might do some mechanical cleaning on the teeth. Here I'm thinking of like a tiger in a zoo where you feed it whole rabbits instead of ground up rabbits, right? But yeah, so when we think about wet versus dry food, for commercial types of formulations, we do tend to see what we would think of as a better oral microbiome or some more positive oral health outcomes from dry food versus from wet food. That's particularly the case in dogs. In cats, the results are a little bit more inconsistent from study to study. And certainly we do see a different oral microbiome in wet versus dry food in cats and dogs. So I think more research needed to know what would be optimal, right? And I'd be very interested to see, again, what that would look like in some of these very low carbohydrate sort of diets, like a typical raw diet. That'd be very interesting, but I'm not aware in pets of any research on that.
Gotcha. Okay, we're coming up to the 11 o'clock, top of the hour here, and we've had some excellent questions, but unfortunately we are running out of time. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share, Dr. Jarrett?
Oh, no. Well, thank you for having me. It's been really fun to talk with everybody. And as you can see, I just love to talk about this and could talk about it forever. I think it's just such an exciting area of research and a really exciting time with so much science coming out. So I'm really excited about all the possibilities open to all of us in the pet industry to really use some of this research to support pets and really improve their lives in a meaningful way. Looking forward to seeing how Cargill and others really continue to turn that into impact for pets.
Good deal. Yeah, and thanks to you, Jess. That was incredibly informative. I have all kinds of little mental notes that I'm going to go look up myself now. And thank you to our audience. Thank you for your excellent questions, and thank you for joining us. And of course, I'd like to give a great big thank you to Cargill for sponsoring this edition of Ask the Pet Food Pro. Please watch for more Ask the Pet Food Pro chats brought to you by Pet Food Industry and Pet Food Forum. I'm Tim Wall, Senior Reporter for Pet Food Industry. Also thanking the Watt Global Media staff for making this possible. And thank you to our international audience for joining us. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day or evening, depending on which side of the planet you're on. So until next time on Ask the Pet Food Pro, goodbye.